Costco stock is down over 18% year to date, and it's well off its 52-week high, closer to $612 per share. On today's show, we'll look at Costco's valuation. We'll take a look at the most recent earnings, which came out after the bell. We'll take a look at the revenue, the profit, the cash flows, and all the things that you need to know when it comes to Costco. We'll talk about the all-important membership fees and whether or not those are set to go up here very soon. And then we'll look at Costco from a technical perspective as well. Has this pulled into an area which has historically been a great place to buy Costco? We'll talk about that and more on today's show. What is going on, investors? Hopefully guys are doing well out there. Time to talk about Costco. Over the last week, we've seen Target, we've seen Walmart, we've seen Dick's Sporting Goods and Macy's and Nordstrom, and all the retailers start to report, and today we get Costco. Now, on the earnings, we had really solid earnings growth over at Costco, up 16% year over year on those earnings, up to $52.6 billion. That beat expectations by over $1 billion. When I look out onto Costco's earnings estimates in the upcoming quarters, the upcoming quarter is expected to be extraordinarily strong over at Costco, up 11% year over year, to then slow to kind of like high to low single digit growth, at least on that revenue side. Now, when I look at Wall Street's earnings estimates, I actually see those start to accelerate in the upcoming quarters into that actually double-digit range on that profit side. And I think something that is already being priced in by analysts is the fact that Costco is likely to raise their membership dues sometime this summer. The company usually raises its membership dues every 5 years by about $5 to $10. So depending on where on that spectrum Costco decides to raise their membership dues, well, that could be a significant amount of money, because when we come over here and look at this company, and obviously many of you are familiar with Costco's business model, but if you're not familiar with Costco's business model, off of $51.6 billion worth of revenue, they spent $46.3 billion just in the merchandise cost. So they are marking this up just low single digits, and then obviously they have all the employees and all the back office staff that they've got to pay as well. So you get down to very, very low margins on the actual sales of goods over at Costco. In fact, it's called Costco Wholesale for a reason, because it's basically a wholesale place where they're marking the goods up just minuscule amounts. Where they make the vast majority or the large percentage of the operating income and net income over at Costco is actually the membership fee. So when those rise, those tend to really accelerate earnings over at Costco. And so I'm kind of seeing that baked into Wall Street's estimates already. The fact that we'll probably have more mediocre growth on that revenue side, but we'll have several quarters, if not 2 years, of renewals and new members coming in at a much higher price over at Costco certainly will be beneficial for the stock. And so a lot of people are saying, hey, the stock is overvalued. And so I've got two different traditional valuation metrics that I want to look at with Costco. I've got a price to sales metric here, and then I've got a price to earnings. Sure, we could compare this to Walmart or Target or a number of different retailers, but when you have a retailer like Costco that has been around as long as it has and has been as consistent as it has, quite frankly, you can just compare the results to itself. And we're seeing with Costco right now trading right around just fractionally below about 1x sales. Now, it was much higher than that earlier this year, clearly a little bit overvaluation for Costco, but it's the price to sales multiple over at Costco, while it's still high at 1x sales, this stock is traded as low as maybe 0.5, 0.6x sales more historically, but it still is kind of an upward trend. So investors constantly don't mind paying a little bit bigger multiple on sales for Costco, because we'll talk about here in a minute. You've got a dividend, you've got buybacks, you've got things like that definitely help out stocks like this. Now, what has also come in tremendously is this price to earnings. Right now, we're trading about 35 times. I mean, we're up here 40, nearly 50 times earnings on this one. More historically, this one's been more comfortable south of this 35 times sales, and that's basically where we're at. The other thing that we have to factor in is these earnings estimates are going to start to come in, and if we switch this to kind of an annual view, you'll see kind of stretching things out into 2027, 2028. I know that seems like a long ways away, but if you're kind of buying and holding this stock, you're more or less buying the earnings into the future. Well, if Costco stays on their kind of earnings trajectory that Wall Street has for it, well, it'll get down into kind of the 20 times, 17, 18 times in terms of that forward PE. And certainly from a price to sales, we'll move back into kind of a more traditional multiple. So are you paying paying a premium for Costco today versus 5 or 6 years ago? Well, yeah, of course, but it's not as wildly overvalued as it was maybe a month or two ago, or a couple of quarters ago is a better way to say it, when we've been looking at Costco. So not wildly undervalued, but certainly not as overvalued as we've seen over at Costco. Now, I talked about these revenues, $51 billion. It was 44 last year on a 12-week period. On a 36-week period, you went from 130 up to 151. We talked about how low margin this business is because you've got $51 billion worth of net sales. You've got over $50 billion worth of operating expenses, and you get to chug out operating income about $1.7 billion. The vast majority of that is coming from the $984 million worth of membership fees in the most recent quarter. You see, last year you were at about $900 million. These should top $1 billion here very soon, and certainly if you add $5 to $10 onto each membership, it'll accelerate much faster than that. A lot of this flows all the way down to net income after you pay your interest, after you pay your taxes. You come down to about 1.4 billion rounded on that net income side. You earn $3.04 diluted share on Costco. This is a company that pays $3.60 on a dividend rate. Every couple of years, you also get a special dividend. I wouldn't rule that out at some point here with Costco pretty soon. I think they gave one out a year or two ago. Seems like every 2 years or so, they tend to pay out a special dividend over at Costco because this is a company that just makes a lot of money, quite frankly, on a very consistent basis. From a balance sheet perspective, you've got about the same amount of cash as last year. You've got about the same amount of assets. We've been looking at merchandise inventory. Any of these retailers that we've been looking at during this earnings season, we've seen an acceleration in inventory. Went from 14.2 last year up to about 17 billion in the most recent quarter. I would guess, without diving into the conference call, it's going to be similar to Walmart. I did go through Walmart's entire conference call. The CEO noted that a lot of inventory money, especially when you're selling food items like Costco, food item has to be a massive portion of Costco's business. And we've just seen massive food inflation over the last year or so. And so that is where a lot of this merchandise inventory likely is being chewed up. The fact that they're just having to pay more for these items. Everything else is about what you'd expect over at Costco. You got about the same amount of long-term debt. And that's it. That's as simple as some of you guys might be saying, hey, he's cutting corners. He's getting lazy. It must be a Friday over there. No, it's literally a 3-page press release for their financials. I tell you what, sometimes the best companies like Costco and Apple have the most simplest financials. They don't try to hide anything. I think it would be useful if we got a cash flow statement out of Costco, but they don't always do that on their earnings reports. Now, from a technical perspective, this one very briefly, just a couple of days ago, has pulled into what I have identified maybe kind of as a longer term uptrend. Now, this might not be drawn in here perfectly. There's lots of ways you can probably manipulate it and make it look kind of good, but I think you can agree with me that going back all the way into the summer of 2017, Costco stock has just been in a steady uptrend. There has been some deviations when the Fed started tightening in that 2018 timeframe, and then all of a sudden the Powell pivot hit. Yeah, we had a dip below the range. We also had a dip below the range back here. It actually is ironically in March of 2021 when most stocks actually bottomed kind of in March of 2020 when COVID hit the shores here in the United States. Well, Costco's day came about a year later, but then rocketed upwards. And I think we could all agree at this time Costco stock was just overvalued from a lot of different metrics, and it has pulled back, and now we're kind of in this range. In fact, we're sitting right on top of it. I did consider buying shares the other day. Obviously, in hindsight, when Costco was down here at about $420 per share in the shorter term, made a nice investment because we've popped up here to $450. If you're dollar cost averaging into Costco or you're trying to acquire more shares, I wouldn't be super concerned. Stocks were super oversold, and I think it made sense that they made a nice little bounce back. You have a pretty sizable gap here with Costco. Wouldn't surprise me, quite frankly, if we walk up here and fill this gap up into the $480 per share. Otherwise, I would expect this and probably a lot of stocks to have at least one more, maybe potentially maybe a couple quarters of going sideways, if not trading down. You walk back kind of into the middle of this range that we have marked out here. Certainly can be a buying opportunity, at least in the shorter and even intermediate intermediate term. Now, understand though that this bottom trend line continues to move up, so you don't necessarily have to wait until the stock price gets all the way to the bottom of this range, because if you look over the past like 6 or 7 years, the stock is traded underneath this bottom trend line for just a couple of days. So if you're not out there watching this stock super closely, or have alerts set on your phone, or have the trades kind of already pre-planned, well, you can miss this stock at the bottom of the range. So I wouldn't necessarily get too picky. That's why I really strongly considered buying this stock at these levels just a couple of days ago. I did not end up doing that. Part of that is just because you have such a large range of stocks that have made such a long pullback. Even a stock like Costco might not be as attractive as some of your other options. But I think going forward, if you want a dollar cost average into this one, I think we'll pull comfortably more into the middle of this range. Again, remember, as time goes on, we'll walk up this trend line. So even buying the stock today at about 440 could end up being kind of the bottom end of a price range in a couple of months. So it could be a comfortable place to add shares of your Costco. I think you buy and hold this one. You buy and hold it for this regular membership fee that continues to go up. You buy this one for the steady earnings growth, the steady dividend growth, the occasional special dividend. It's not wildly overvalued like it was maybe just a couple of months ago. You certainly can sell stocks like this if they get to that level. Otherwise, you just keep holding this stock. This is one of the best retailers I think you can do that in. Any major pullback in Costco, I think, is a back the truck up type moment when it comes to this type of stock. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed today's video. Back in soon with more. Good luck with your investments.